Hey, it's Jordan. Delighted to be joined by Harvey J, is a professor emeritus of democracy and justice studies and the director of the Center for History and Social Change at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. Also the author of The Fight for the Four Freedoms and a historian of the New Deal era. I wanted to have you on because I don't know, about a year or so ago, it was almost like all these media outlets got on a conference call and decided Joe Biden was FDR. Here's just a sampling of one of those. This was from the New York Times. Joe Biden is electrifying America like FDR. Obviously, right now, we have some of the worst economic numbers in decades. You have inflation, not to mention just income inequality worsened during the pandemic. Billionaires got richer. Biden seems to be running on that this is a historic economy and a historic comeback and all those things. I wanted to have you on to start with. How did those Biden is the FDR narratives do a year later?
A year later? I think I think it was pretty clear, actually, a few months in, that was they were creating a great myth about this new Democratic administration. I mean, the first telling thing, because I actually for a moment myself started to wonder if I might be wrong, that maybe he would actually rise to the occasion and behave more like FDR than I ever expected because of the American Rescue Plan as an indicator. But it was a very telling moment when the Democratic Party, eight of the Democratic senators blocked Bernie's intention to include a $15 minimum wage inside of the American Rescue Plan. And I guess the even more telling thing is that the two of the eight senators were the senators from Delaware, Biden's own state, and presumably at least one of them had been Biden's mentee. I think that would be Chris Coons. So it's striking to me that almost immediately people could see that this was not going to be an FDR administration. I mean, and I'll just note that when FDR signed the National Industrial Recovery Act into law in that first 100 days, that famous first 100 days, it included the first federal minimum wage. And when he signed it, FDR actually said no company should be allowed to exist in this country, or operate in this country, that did not pay a living wage. So, I mean, where was Biden when the question of the $15 an hour minimum wage came up? Soon enough, where was Biden when he might well have signed an end to the student debt, the mess of the student debt, and encouraged young people to actually go out and do stuff, and if nothing else, be encouraged to vote Democratic sometime in the near future. I mean, we saw in the course of that year. Look, we saw. I mean, Build Back Better. I don't know. I was looking for other words off of it for the Build Back Better. It was like, some kind of joke the way the Democrats handled it. And by the way, it isn't simply Biden. It's also Schumer and Pelosi. It's really the Democratic Party leadership in Washington, D.C. that really clearly has no intention of allowing for an FDR-style administration, an administration which would empower working people, an administration which actually would launch major initiatives to create jobs, an administration which really would have seen that young people needed themselves to be liberated from crushing debt. I mean, it's just astounding to me what we've seen. And, the one question that I keep coming back to, and I don't mean to go on about this, but was this administration really determined to lose in 2022? I mean, I used to think it was a joke when people wondered about that. And now, I mean, seriously speaking, I can envision Democrats winning, and
Right.
if they lose as we expect, even if they don't lose as big as I expect or many of us expect, you can bet that the following 2 years are going to be a nightmare, if only because those Republicans are going to do everything that they want, and Biden, has already shown he's not even fully there half the time. As we saw his failure to do something about the $15 minimum wage, his failure to figure out how to handle Manchin and Sinema. I mean, it's inconceivable. Sorry, I'm just this morning I'm particularly riled because I received a note from David Sirota that points out or reminds us all that Biden has appointed or has named an appointment to the Social Security Advisory Board, which includes somebody who has a history of wanting to either privatize or in some way subvert the entire Social Security system. So, I mean, I'm really just outraged today.
And the thing that never made sense to me, I mean, I know why the media did this for narrative's sake, but FDR, in a, I wouldn't say exactly the same, but semi-similar economic woes and unprecedented crisis, which was the Great Depression, we had coronavirus. He did not push forward programs that expired in a year. He pushed forward programs that were long-standing, permanent programs, and he pushed through structural change, which there was an appetite for. Whereas Biden, I mean, I think the coronavirus relief package had some good things in it, but when you're saying, hey, we cut poverty in half until this calendar date, that's not exactly, world changing.
Well, I'm sorry. Yeah. That child tax credit that cut, I couldn't believe that people were just going on and on about the fact it cut child poverty by half. And I thought to myself, what? I mean, if they could do that, why couldn't they cut child poverty altogether? And I will tell you that for at least a year before the entire campaign season, and I still do a weekly radio show that comes out of the Boston area with a guy named Jeff Santos. And I remember starting this question of addressing poverty with an argument. Okay, Dems, you don't want to create Medicare for all. How about Medicare for all kids? And that way, as 17-year-olds become 18-year-olds and can vote, they'll increase the possibilities of Medicare for all because they'll have lost out on their Medicare and they'll want to vote to resecure it. I mean, look, the Democratic, Biden is a consequence of 45 years of class war against the democratic achievements of the long age of Roosevelt from the 30s through the 60s. Now, not everything FDR did in the first year would necessarily have been permanent. And in fact, the two major initiatives, National Industrial Recovery Act and the Agricultural Adjustment Act, both were found to be unconstitutional by a still conservative Supreme Court in 1935. But it didn't deter FDR. Okay. In other words, a whole host of other things that he did in the course of that first year, which literally led in 1934 midterm elections, to win all the more seats for Democrats. It is astounding. I promise I'll stop. It is astounding that the Democrats, if they have any kind of hope of holding on to power, cannot bother to look back and ask themselves, what did it take for FDR to at least hold on to control of Congress? And he didn't just hold on. He literally smashed his way to a tremendous victory.
Right. Absolutely. And the other thing also is going to, are Democrats trying to lose? I mean, Biden's approval numbers were very high after the coronavirus relief package.
Right.
They were very popular proposals. So you basically have Manchin and Sinema blocking Build Back Better. I mean, Biden's pretty animated when going after Republicans, but he chose not to use the bully pulpit of the presidency to pressure Manchin and Sinema. I mean, they were pressured by activists, but not the president. FDR said, I invite your hatred to wealthy people. What are your thoughts on Biden? Has basically, we were fed, he's the pragmatic choice. He could get things done, but he refused to publicly crusade against either of these senators who maybe it would have done nothing, but we don't know. At least Manchin has a thin skin. I think there's a better chance of making these two fold than trying to, compromise with the Republicans.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, if we think let's not even think legislatively for a moment. I mean, legislation is what's at stake, but the bigger question of what's at stake is power. And the fact is that let us suppose he could not have persuaded Manchin and Sinema. Let's suppose that he knew he couldn't, no matter what it would take. But I can tell you this, what if he had gone on the road? What if he did something along the lines of what FDR did? FDR had his entire cabinet basically go on the road to promote the New Deal. Keep in mind, FDR empowered people from the moment he took office. He created the Civilian Conservation Corps. he included in the National Industrial Recovery Act in 1933, the bill I referred to before that he signed into law regarding a whole host of things, including the first federal minimum wage. It actually also included the right of workers to organize. Now, it turned out the capitalists found a way around that bill, but that's that act. But that's why in 1935, FDR, at Wagner's encouragement and the labor movement's demand, signed into law the National Labor Relations Act, which not only empowered workers to organize, it placed the federal government behind workers in their efforts to organize. Now, Biden, what did he do in that stretch to begin with? He said, well, regarding Amazon down in Bessemer, Alabama, he said, workers have a right to organize. Hey, that's a matter of fact. That's not telling us that Biden is going to make sure they can organize by pushing that. Moreover, why couldn't he have called up Bernie, the younger members of the Progressive Caucus, and said, we've got to make this Build Back Better work. We're going to take a show on the road. Let's go to West Virginia. I'll tell Manchin, we're coming to West Virginia with a show, and we'll bring a whole host of celebrities with us because we want the Build Back Better to become law. And then let's suppose he still couldn't convince Manchin and Sinema. But I can tell you this, he would not necessarily have been viewed as a loser. American working people would have viewed him as somebody who was willing to fight and to bring them out to fight what in a way that would make this country that much better than it was under the Trump administration and even for the past 45 years. So if you don't mobilize and if you don't encourage people to mobilize and not only to show up, but to push you in turn, well, then why are people ever going to turn out if you're constantly losing and not in any way looking like you're fighting and encouraging others? That was Bernie when he said, not me, us. He said, I'm not going to do this by myself. We're all going to have to do this. He said it in 2016 on the chance he might have won then. He said it in 2020. Biden has been nothing like Bernie. And moreover, FDR was even more aggressive than people realize on these kinds of questions. In 1938, when he didn't succeed in doing it, because it would likely have been a miracle if he had, he decided he was going to try to purge the Democratic Party of reactionaries. He actually went down to Georgia and essentially called the Democratic, call them the Dixie Dems if you like, call them the Southern white supremacists who ruled in Georgia. He talked about the fact that the South was holding back the nation's recovery. And then he said, and if you believe in this system that operates down here, you believe in fascism. And I'm quoting him. I'm not paraphrasing him. Where has Biden been with language like that? And to go back to your original question regarding the media, look, the media itself is, you're here, you're doing what you're doing, and others like you do what you do because the mainstream media is itself tied up with the entire neoliberal machine of the past 45 years.
Right. Absolutely. And what do you think Bernie, the squad's role in this is? Obviously, they're not president. But to me, I've covered the Amazon workers organizing. I've covered Starbucks workers organizing. And you have movement. It's not, the 1930s type of union movement, but you finally have some momentum in organized labor strikes all over the country. But Bernie particularly has really chosen this kind of inside game diplomacy with Biden, already said he would support him in 2024, even though Biden has basically backtracked on the very minuscule promises he even made. Should Bernie and the squad be more aggressive in calling out Biden and demanding that he do more in terms of executive authority or rallying the troops? Because not enough just to say, hey, Republicans are crazy, demanding that Biden show leadership on $15 minimum wage, public option that he ran on, and other things.
Yeah, I actually think Bernie was smart in saying what he said right now about Biden. I don't think going in front of the cameras and saying something aggressive that would smack at Biden would be of any advantage now that we're already deeply into this 2022 campaign season. But I can't help but imagine that maybe a year ago, Bernie should have taken a few of the members of the squad in to see Biden to say, how do we make sure that a year from now, the Democrats can win. Now, I don't know if that meeting occurred, but if he didn't do it early on, then he's at fault for not having done that, okay? I think it would be terrible timing for Bernie now to show no faith, no confidence in Biden. What advantage would there be to that right now? I think the other, but I do think in that very same, I think it was sort of an interview on the run that he gave somebody, he actually said, we need, what we need, and this would have been great maybe a few months ago to have been launched, something like Gingrich's contract with America. So, for example, I'm going to give you an example of exactly what I mean, and I'm hoping maybe that Bernie will will pick up on this, and I'm hoping to at some point be able to speak to him. Bernie ran in 2015, 16, then again in 1920 by recalling FDR. And I won't repeat all the criticisms I would make of the way in which he could have done more of that. More importantly, Bernie in 2019 had on his website an economic bill of rights, which was in many ways at the heart of the legacy of FDR's vision. In 1944, he gave a State of the Union message in which he said, we've come to the point in our history where we realize that needy people are not free people. And he went on to lay out the imperative of a second Bill of Rights, an economic Bill of Rights, which, by the way, based on surveys that he commissioned from the White House, his call for an economic Bill of Rights was actually empowered by what Americans wanted, because in the surveys, they asked Americans, what do you want to see after the war? And they wanted, to the tune of almost 85% of them, wanted national health care. They wanted a job with a living wage. They wanted a guarantee that young people could pursue an education, public education, free as far as their capacities would take them. And they wanted housing to be secured by the federal government. They wanted those things, and they believed it was possible based on, one, what they accomplished in the New Deal as a generation, and decidedly what they were accomplishing in the course of the war effort. So he proposed an economic Bill of Rights, which, by the way, remained very much a part of a lot of progressives' thinking all the way through the 1960s, when the Democratic Party in 1960 itself laid out their platform in terms of FDR's economic Bill of Rights. A. Philip Randolph proposed a freedom budget based on the 4 freedoms that FDR spoke of in 41 and the economic Bill of Rights in 44. Martin Luther King Jr., not long before his death in 1968, called for an economic Bill of Rights for all Americans. I mean, that's what Bernie was doing. Well, maybe what Bernie ought to do now is gather together progressives, so it won't seem as if it's a smack at Biden, but call them together and literally lay out the imperative that the Democratic Party pursue the creation of an economic Bill of Rights as its party's vision and agenda. Do it even if it's too late for 2022. Make it imperative for 2024. And I'll just footnote that by saying Ro Khanna, in his recent book, actually refers to FDR's economic Bill of Rights. Marianne Williamson has raised the question of the economic Bill of Rights with me. Nina Turner didn't win, but she urgently put forth this past winter a call for an economic Bill of Rights. Here in the state of Wisconsin, Democrats are beginning to call for it in the state assembly. The Massachusetts Democratic Party has embraced an economic Bill of Rights that Alan Minsky and I have proposed by way of a series of articles in Common Dreams. In other words, it's there waiting to be grabbed hold of. It wouldn't help for Bernie to smack at Biden. It sure as hell would help if Bernie and the squad and other progressives, Ro Khanna and others, came together around a vision that the Democratic Party could begin to fight for.
Yeah, I think also, and I kind of disagree because I think Biden's approvals are so low. I even think he's losing some of the kind of neoliberal folks that voted for him. I do think that.
Let me just say that on the grounds that you're going to make your argument, I don't disagree with the nightmare of going into this 2022 election with Biden, but he's not going to step down if Bernie all of a sudden challenges him. That's I don't see any particular immediate value to dissing Biden by Bernie.
Well, one thing that's pretty different from FDR and now, Yeah, there was some special interest influence, but you did not have the tsunami of money in politics that you have now, and zero rules on that money in politics. What part do you think this plays? Because to me, Biden could wax poetic about the Constitution, which the filibuster is not in, but very clear the donors are driving the bus here on a lot of things, including I don't think the donors want the removal of a filibuster, which maintains the status quo, prevents bold things from passing, and really only gets us kind of quote unquote bipartisan accomplishments, which are really crumbs for the masses. To me, honestly, if Bernie and the squad are going to do anything, we have to start actively calling for serious reforms in terms of money in politics. And a lot of these protest movements do not have an economic component. In the 1930s, unions were ready to strike. There was an economic threat adjoined with, boots on the ground. Well, what are your thoughts on that?
Okay, well, you've said a lot of things there, so let me take them up one by one. First of all, there were quite a few. Look, when Roosevelt ran, big money did not oppose him, in good part because the richest people in America imagined that he had a good chance of winning, and moreover, that he made a promise that literally could save their asses. And I'll tell you what it was. He was going to end prohibition. And the richest people in America knew that if FDR won, that they were going to see their taxes go up. So they figured we don't really need to worry. Prohibition will rescue us from high taxes because working people will pay a nickel. They'll pay a nickel, and they'll pay taxes on every drink they have. That will get us out of having to raise taxes on the rich. But they were wrong. He not only ended prohibition, he definitely raised the taxes on what we would call the billionaire class, the richest people in America. And by the way, most working people didn't pay income taxes. It was definitely, they didn't exist for most people because they didn't make enough money to do so. Well, here's the thing. So they created these very wealthy figures. Okay, it would be as if today Bezos and what's his name, the Tesla guy, what's his Musk. Thank you. It's as if they got together and announced publicly, we've created a new organization. And they called it back in 1934 and 35, the American Liberty League, specifically with the intention of portraying FDR as either a fascist or a communist, in any case, as an authoritarian who was literally destroying constitutional rule in America. And they spend vast sums of money. But guess what? They couldn't get any kind of grassroots support. Why not? Because in his first year and two, FDR empowered working people, created jobs, literally enabled them to mobilize. Now, what have we got? What have we got today? Well, I agree with you. Biden is he's a disaster. B, he's terribly unpopular. Okay, so what is there to do? Well, I agree with you in what you said Bernie and the squad might well have done, but it's late now. The tragedy is, I don't know how in July, which is going to, come around next week in the July 4th season, they're going to come out with something that will somehow save the Democratic Party in November. But they should have been doing this all along. To my knowledge, it's been much too quiet. I mean, I don't even know if there is such a thing as a progressive caucus, frankly. I don't know if they, or at least they don't have the right to call themselves a progressive caucus from what I can see. Okay, the squad has been effectively silenced right now. I mean, the most progressives within the so-called progressive caucus. But I do think they do need to start not simply criticizing the party. They need to lay out a vision. They've got to be moving beyond this moment already. Look, the Democratic Party, I'm going to just have to get this out. The Democratic Party, you ask people what the Democratic Party is about, and I'm willing to bet most of them will answer you, even if they vote Democratic, they will answer you somehow or other in Republican talking points. That is, they'll either criticize in Republican talking points or they'll defend the party against Republican talking points, but they will never talk to us. They'll never tell us, if we were to ask them, that the Democratic Party stands for the interests of working people, to fight inequality, to raise wages, to provide health care, to guarantee economic security. They won't tell us that. But that's what they did tell journalists and others about FDR. They won't tell that today. The Democratic Party, all the cultural war stuff, they've allowed themselves to be utterly distracted from what matters to Americans. Right. Jobs, healthcare, housing, education, and I'm probably leaving out, similar kinds of things. That's what working people want. And by the way, they have little desire, little desire to support the right-wing neo-fascist type agenda. But when has the Democratic Party in these last 40 years stood forth in a fashion that FDR would have stood forth on, and in favor of promoting healthcare, which he did not succeed in securing, but he wanted to include it in the Social Security Act, and he called for it any number of times right through the rest of his administration. When have we seen this? Right now, seriously speaking, the Democratic Party presents itself without a story, without a vision. And the only way we can win in the future is if the progressives take over the party in the sense of start speaking in terms of a story and a vision. Start reclaiming. This is what I've been going on about for years now. Start reclaiming the progressive story that America is. Stop deferring. Stop allowing the right-wingers to hijack the American past. Recall, if you don't want to go too far back, you're embarrassed by certain kinds of things, at least talk about the New Deal, the empowerment of working people, which, by the way, persisted. One of every 3 workers in the mid-50s was in a labor union in the private sector. And by, the 60s, you were seeing, because of, public employee unionism, the expansion of the labor movement, despite the decline of manufacturing that was taking place then because of automation. I mean, there's just no... Cut this out if you... There's no fucking historical imagination in the Democratic Party.
Right. And also, it's kind of hard to do the things you're saying if when a little bit of heat comes on you from the media. I mean, the progressive caucus, they were playing hardball at the end of last year. They were not willing to vote for this infrastructure deal, which in my view was just a privatization scheme. It's a Band-Aid compared to our actual economic and infrastructure needs. But they were holding fast. They were not willing to give their vote. And then the media, Terry McAuliffe loses in Virginia. The media spins Terry McAuliffe's loss as because the progressives won't find the infrastructure, and they fold like cheap tents. So you can't really even begin, changing the narrative if you have paper tigers in there as progressives.
Yeah, I don't ever want to hear a progressive take a stage without recalling FDR. Right now, there should a moment should not be lost, and that moment is now. Let the progressives lay claim to the American story. Let them advance an economic Bill of Rights vision. Let them say that if you look. My friend Alan Minsky likes to say there are really 3 parties. Unfortunately, they're not. We have a 2-party system with 3 political forces in America. We have the reactionary, neo-fascist, Trumpster types who've literally captured the Republican Party. We have the corporate Dems, or centrists, if the media gets its way in their language, which includes everyone from the Romney folks over to the Clinton folks, and it includes the likes of Biden, and it included Obama. And then we have the progressives. Okay, but the progressives don't command a party. They're kept in abeyance. They're kept in abeyance by the Democratic Party leadership. They're kept in abeyance by the corporate folks who will spend millions to block what Americans really want by blocking and obstructing and literally buying television time 24 hours a day. And then and what are the progressives going to do? Well, they're going to have to do something collectively, not individually. Bill Moyers some years ago said, don't give us an agenda, give us a story. When the Democrats start affording. When progressive Democrats are start affording a story, then people may well be reminded, look, most Americans are terribly angry about the state of affairs in this country. Back in 2015, there was a very interesting survey done. It asked Americans, what kind of change do you wish to see in the United States? The majority of Americans actually used the word radical. And what they were offered in 2016 in the primaries in the Democratic Party was corporate Democrat Hillary and Bernie Sanders. And the corporate Democrats ruled the party. So what they do, they voted for the radical Trump. And I will remind everyone that Trump, when he was on the debate stage with other Republicans, came across as if he was going to defend Medicare and a whole host of things. He came across as if he was the sort of the radical in the crew, not because he was going to undo everything, but rather he was going to make sure Americans got better than what they had. Well, of course, he lied. The Republicans, won the day. He signed off on a tax cut for the rich. Okay. The tragedy was that Bernie could not win in 2015-16. There was a Clinton machine. The tragedy was that in 2019 and 20, Bernie himself seemed to hesitate rather than take charge of the debates by calling FDR onto the stage with him. And now is the time. Look, FDR was a man of serious moral mistakes. Okay. I mean, he couldn't do anything about desegregating the South. The New Deal was not deliberately created to exclude blacks. They couldn't get key things passed without the Southern Democratic folks who headed the committees. Okay, but nevertheless, it remained the case that it's a shame that FDR couldn't. Okay, 2, the internment of the Japanese Americans, and 3, his failure to purge the State Department of anti-Semites and his failure to open the door all the more to European refugees, Jews in particular. But that's having said that, that was a progressive age in which an entire generation of teenagers and young adults who, when they had the chance to go progressive as adults, did so in the 1960s. They're the ones who elected the Senate that passed Medicare, Medicaid, civil rights, voting rights, immigration reform, environmental protection, workplace protections. I mean, you've got to start building back, not build back better, but you have to start building back the progressivism. And you also mentioned labor, and I want to say something about that. Right now, the tragedy is that the AFL-CIO is dominated by the old folks, just as the Democratic Party is dominated by the old folks. And the fact is that we desperately need a progressive, if not militant and radical labor movement that will not only organize, but will literally offer a vision of rights for all workers, of economic rights. So I'm with you on that. And there are leaders. I mean, my champion in the labor movement right now is Sarah Nelson, and I support her wholeheartedly. I was hoping that she would be capable of an insurgent campaign to win the presidency of the AFL-CIO. But having said that, it remains the case that there are a lot of good folks in labor. There is a surge at the ground level. Workers want action. So if you get progressives trying to take hold of the party with a vision, and you get the energy and labor and leadership such as Sarah Nelson and her colleagues and comrades might afford, then we might have a chance, if not in 2022, because it is getting late, maybe in 2024 to reclaim American democracy. As Sarah and I have spoken, labor has a responsibility right now, and I don't know if they can do it or not, but they have a responsibility to save democracy.
Don't get me started, by the way, on the AFL-CIO. I don't know why the hell they're holding conferences with Biden, who's a fake union guy. He's not a union guy.
Right.
He's
right.
been not the rank and file, but some union leadership in this country and their support for Joe Biden hasn't made a whole lot of sense to me, but that's another story.
That's another day, right?
Real quick, there are parallels. I mean, in the 30s, you had Hitler, Mussolini, fascism brewing across the globe. Here, I think a weak and basically a lack of a real opposition to the Republican Party You don't have an economic alternative to the Republican Party. Most of these neoliberal Democrats are running, they're crazy, vote for us. There's no economic populist alternative.
Right.
And it's emboldening, to me, a growing shade of fascism when you look at that, trying to overturn elections. Right now, Trump loyalists are trying to remove election officials across various states who certified the election for Trump, put in Trump loyalists, not to mention, their attacks on LGBTQ people, transgender people. We could go down the list. Are Democrats emboldening this by basically running? I forgot. New York Times is reporting Democrats are trying to help some of those candidates.
Yes, I saw that. I saw that. Yeah.
Win their primaries, kind of like the Hillary Clinton strategy to get Trump to win the Republican nomination, thinking he'd be an easier candidate. Are Democrats helping some of these authoritarians, grow in power?
Yeah. Yes, they are. But here's the thing. Let's keep in mind, let's get this in perspective. The reason I say yes is if we go back to the 2016 election, Hillary versus Trump. Okay. Let's make it clear. I know Bernie would have won in 2016. Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. Okay. I've been a part of the labor movement in Wisconsin for as long as I've been in the state, which is now probably approaching 45 years. Okay. And I can tell you that this began back in the 80s. I was hearing working people say, what are the Democrats about? What are they doing? And in fact, that's when it was then, not necessarily in 1980, but then when you started to see Democrats, working class Democrats, become Reagan Democrats. Reagan won in 1980 pretty much because Carter was such an abysmal president that people just stayed home. But thereafter, the Democrats offered no alternative. Mondale didn't offer an alternative. Dukakis didn't offer. It just kept going and going. Hell, Clinton was more Republican than Dwight Eisenhower, basically. I mean, Dwight Eisenhower figured if you tried to go after the things that Clinton went after, the Republican Party would never have been heard from again. And then all of a sudden, it's the Democratic Party that's doing that kind of stuff. So I had students who told me that if Bernie had been running, there was no doubt their parents were going to vote for Bernie. They actually wanted progressive action. Look, nobody wants to use the word because somehow we've gotten locked into this concept of democratic socialism. What American working people want is social democracy. That's what they want. They don't want socialism because it's an ism. They don't want isms, working people. They want social democracy. That's what matters. And that is what FDR afforded regularly in the 30s and even into the war years, even though he didn't use the term. He redefined liberalism, radically redefined liberalism, and that became the word that stood in for social democracy in this country. But later liberals, in the 70s and thereafter, and the media loved calling them liberals, had literally given up what FDR liberalism was about. Well, it's time for us not to talk about democratic socialism, but to talk about social democracy, to give with working people's energies involved. So I don't like the word give. It's time for working people to be reminded of what they're capable of accomplishing because they've done it before. In other words, I mean, I'm convinced, I have little doubt that most Americans carry around a kind of latent progressivism. They were raised with it. It's called life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. FDR, as did Lincoln, grabbed hold of that promise and pursued radical change in the name of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Why? Because he said you cannot have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness without some kind of economic security. Okay. In fact, I said this the other day. I can't believe I actually mouthed it, but I think FDR understood you couldn't have prosperity without assuring economic security. Prosperity didn't afford economic security. Economic security afforded by a progressive government will provide and encourage the prosperity.
Thank you, Professor Harvey Kaye. Professor Emeritus, Democracy and Justice Studies, and the director of the Center for History and Social Change at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. And folks could check out his book, The Fight for the Four Freedoms. Thanks a lot. We'll stay in touch.
Thankfully. Thank you.
Thanks for watching, and make sure to tune in to Status Coup's daily live stream Monday through Thursday at 5 o'clock Eastern Time and Fridays at 4 o'clock Eastern Time.